And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 243. Today we're looking at the Shadow and Light Challenge. We've had 16 people send in images to this challenge. We talked all about the notion of shadow and light back 2 podcasts ago, episode 241. So if you want to go and check that afterwards, then it's already there. Yes, if you happen to be watching live, leave a comment, let me know you're here and all that kind of stuff, and we'll make a start. Yeah, so welcome, and this is, episode 243, the Shadow and Light Challenge. So yes, like I say, if you happen to be watching live, leave a comment down, over in the comment box, whether that's above or below, depending on the device you're using. Say hello, tell me where you are, tell me what the weather's doing, all the usual kind of stuff. I can see we've got a few people in already, so let's see what we've got. April says, greetings from a mostly cloudy Long Island, New York. Robert says, howdy, all from Texas. John says, hello from Ohio, where the weather is really nice today. Nadia says, hi everyone from a cloudy and wet Fife. Marilyn says, hello from Colorado, where it's almost spring. Almost. Oh gosh, right. We're almost summer here in Scotland. Becca joins us, says, hi everyone from a blustery and sometimes sunny Ayrshire day in June. It's been rainy, chilly, blazing sunshine and overcast today already. As they often say in Scotland, if you don't like the weather, hang on half an hour and you'll get another one. Nich joins us from Bath and says hello all, and Janet says hi from a breezy, mild Port Hood in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Back over in Nova Scotia in Canada. Excellent. Right. Okay. So we have people in. Let's do a quick Smug Points update, and then I'll give an introduction to what this is all about. We can start looking at some photos. So just a wee reminder then that the Smug Points here are about how much you contribute to the podcast. So different kinds of contributions. So if you are here watching live, leave a comment and you automatically get 5 Smug Points to put towards the accumulation. Those who accumulate the most Smug Points, usually at the end of each month, get to choose the challenge for the following month. So far, for the month of May, Robert and Viji tied on 40 Smug Points each, with Anne and Amanda in both tying in second place on 30 Smug Points. Now, generally speaking, it would be you get to choose the challenge for the following month. Robert and Viji have both been, I think, alternating between them for the last couple of months. But I already have an idea for June, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. So what I'm going to be doing in the podcast next Sunday will be setting a challenge for 2 weeks following that. So stick around to the end of the podcast, and I'll tell you all about that as well. So a whole new topic. So what I'm going to do with the Smug Points is essentially do a rollover. So we're going to run May and June together. So the winner of May and June, they will get to choose the topic for the July podcast. Hope that makes sense, everyone. Oh, Maggie's joined us and says everyone. So Maggie's next door with my grandson Alfie, if you happen to be watching. Hi Alfie. Right, so we've had setos, we've had we've had Smug Points. You'll have to forgive me slightly. If I seem slightly out of sorts, I've got a slightly new setup here. One of my screens died on me last week, so I've just had to replace it. And I've got a new screen, which is a bigger screen, a better screen. But because I've got a better, larger screen, I've tried sort of moving all the bits and pieces around my screen into a slightly different place, which I think overall will be more efficient. But as whenever you make changes, the efficiencies aren't felt straight away. It's all completely blown out of the water by the fact that you can't quite remember where everything is and where you're supposed to press the buttons. So it might be maybe a couple of episodes before I get the hang of that. Anne joins us from a rainy Dallas. Here in Castle Douglas, it's sort of threatening a bit. It's supposed to be raining a bit later. It was sunny a bit later, a little bit like Becca up in Ayres, kind of a little bit of everything today. Okay, so let's make a little start. So yes, what we're talking about then is shadow and light. And this notion that, well, obviously you can't have shadows without light. But sometimes when we take photos of shadows, the shadow becomes the kind of the key focus. The shadow is the subject. And but what I was really looking for was something where the shadow and the light are balanced, where it feels much more it's about light as well as shadow. Now, interestingly, out of the 16 different entries, there's been variations on this. Some people have really gone much more on the shadow side of it. Some have tried to find that balance of shadow and light, but it's all interesting. It's all different. 2 weeks ago, when I looked at the topic, I talked about several different ways you can interpret that notion of shadow. From the way, like, if you're looking at me now, I've got light falling on this side of my face. This side of my face is partially in shadow. So you've got this sort of shadow on the subject, but then you've also got shadows cast by the subject, so that if I stick my hand over here, you can see a shadow behind it caused by the light over there. And in fact, I can make little shadow puppets and, you know, that kind of thing. Then, well, actually, the way shadow theatre was often done was where you'd have the light behind a sheet and the shadow would fall on the sheet. So it's another way of doing shadows. Very similar then to silhouettes. If you're looking at somebody and the light is entirely behind them, then the whole subject becomes a shadow in its own right. So you have shadows cast. Then you have shadows cast onto subjects. So there's all sorts of different ways you can interpret shadows. And if you're trying to, again, get that sense of you really want to explore, deep dive this a little bit more, I would say go back to episode 241, where I go into a lot more detail about all the different ways you can use shadow in photography. Becca says, would like to have found a more balanced shot for mine, but alas, the sunlight was unobliging. Yeah, there is a certain level whereby, certainly if you're using natural light, you are stuck by the limitations of the natural light in that particular moment, unless you have more time to allow for different conditions. But generally speaking, when you're a bit pressed for time, you kind of have to work with whatever you've got. But then that's part of what photography is as well. I think that, well, there are some kinds of photography whereby what you are doing is you have a particular idea and you pre-plan it, and then you plan it, and then you put everything in place and you make it happen. But an awful lot of photography is trying to make the best out of what you've got. So given the situation I'm in, what can I make that's interesting out of the tools I've got? So given the camera I've got, the lens that I've got, the lighting conditions that I've got, the objects that I've got, the venue, the place that I've got, how can I make something interesting out of this? And that's where a lot of the challenge is with photography, and I think it's quite a bit of fun. Oh, Meg's joined us and says hello everyone. Hi Meg. Right, so okay, let's make a little start. So what I'm going to so this is the whole notion then of the light and shadow challenge. I thought I would actually start, well, let's start with Meg now that you've joined us. So if I do that, no, I don't do that. Yes, I do that. And then I click across here. Woohoo, right. Okay, so this should hopefully be working. So what we have here then is, this is Meg's photo, and Meg says, hi Dad, this was taken from the Crannog down by the loch in Castle Douglas for the challenge for the podcast. Now, the Crannog is a building down at the bottom of Castle Douglas. We've got a loch, Carling Walk Loch. Next to the loch is a building known as the Crannog, which is being taken into kind of public ownership. There's a group, a committee that have taken it over and are going to be developing it. And a little bit, one of the things I've been doing is I've been running a couple of phone photography workshops, and a couple of weeks back I did one on shadow and light, and I'm kind of running a little bit parallel with these podcasts, so that those who come along to the workshops, after having done the workshops, if they wish, can also come along then and get involved with the podcasts. And so just before that workshop, I did a workshop, on shadow and light. And Meg has taken this photo of a corner from the Crannog there. And I rather like it. Yes, I think it's a good start to this notion of light and shadow. So what she's managed to do here is find a little corner of a building where the light is coming down, and the shadow from the edge of this bit of roof is creating this really strong diagonal through the image. And so that we're kind of talking geometry here. We've got these notion of the strong verticals of the building, but also the diagonals of the perspective. You can see the way the base fit is moving up here, the windows are leaning here, so it's kind of moving into the corner, and then we've got this lovely strong dark diagonal coming. So it really is a combination of the shadow and the light which are creating this fantastic kind of triangle shape in the shadow as well. So good start there, Meg. It's a nice one to start with. And okay, a couple of comments. Oh, Becca says, oh, I love seeing the backs of buildings and the bricked up details, etc. Nadia says, nice picture, Meg. Love the texture on the building. April says, hi, Meg. Nice shot. And Anne says, so many fun geometric shapes in that composition. Very nice. Marilyn also says, well done, Meg. Excellent. Okay, so from that one, let's move on to Viji. So Viji in India sent in this one. And Viji says, to shoot some photographs for this photo challenge, I went to the park where I took a photograph of my friend under a structure, but the shadow was not very powerful. Well, this is a kind of a tricky one, I think, where what happens is, so really what's happening, that we've got all these fantastic shadows down on the ground, and they are being created by this overhead structure. The light's coming through, we've got all these geometrical shapes, and they're casting themselves along the ground here. Where I think it sort of potentially falls down a little bit is, whilst your friend's face is partly in shadow, we don't have the clearly defined shadows that fall on her in the way that they fall on the ground. So it's the shadows on the ground, I think, create a very interesting look and shape, but it's not so obvious on your friend. And part of that is because of the complexity and texture of the beautiful orange kind of magenta outfit that she's wearing, and the patterns within it are very busy. Likewise, I mean, if you notice the way the shadows fall on the green plants behind, it also is kind of complex. It's not necessarily that straightforward, which is created by the interesting structure and which is natural shadow and which is just in a dark and which is patterned texture. So the potential is there, I think, but the problem is that it's not working on the person as it. And in terms of the way the narrative works, when we look at a photo, we look at a photo like this, and the first thing we get drawn to is the person. We are hardwired in our brain to notice a person in a picture. And then, generally speaking, when we notice a person, we are then hardwired to notice the face. And then when we get if we get in closer to a face, we're hardwired to notice the eyes. Now, we can't see the eyes directly in this unless we zoom in. She's wearing glasses, the eyes are slightly in shadow. We've got to kind of come into this point before we can see what's going on. But the point is that we get drawn to the body, and then the fact that she's wearing these bright sort of reddish colours against the green of the background makes her stand out. But if the idea of the narrative is what you're trying to communicate is the shadows, when what's really being communicated first, our eye gets first of all drawn to the figure, then this is where it kind of falls apart slightly, is that the primary narrative, if it's supposed to be the shadow, isn't working because the first thing we get our eyes drawn to is the person. Now, it's understanding, if we go back to one of these things that I've said many, many times over the 5 years that I've been doing this podcast, is to understand the narrative. If at the point you're taking the photo, you go, what is it I'm trying to communicate? What's the primary source that I'm trying to communicate here in this photo? And if it's your friend in the environment, that's great because that's what it's about. If it's about the shadow, if that's your first thought that you're trying to communicate, then you have to, at that point, make a different set of decisions about where, maybe you decide that you're only going to focus on the shadow and you find an interesting piece of ground or structure where the lines are falling on it. Or you move your friend into a particular space so that the shadows become more clearly defined as they fall on her. But largely it's about this idea of identify the narrative first, and then it makes all your subsequent decisions afterwards much easier. But yeah, thanks very much for sending that one in, Viji. I could see exactly what you were going for, but it's also sometimes when the photos don't work quite the way that we want them to, it's still quite interesting because it gives us the chance to really explore ways we can sort of set about changing how we approach our photography. So thanks for that, Viji. what have we got? Oh, Meg says, thank you everyone for your comments. Becca says, looks like an amazing structure. April says, cool shadows on the ground and the wall. And Nadia says, nice image, Viji. Okay, next up then, we're going to go to Nich. Oh no, actually, I was right. I decided to swap round Nich and Martin, but I haven't done that in the blurb here. So bear with me. I will just take that there, cut that and slot it back up here so that I have this in the right order. Because I decided to put Martin next, because Martin has sent in this one. And this is actually kind of, it felt much more related to Viji's picture, but one where it works. So here, essentially, what we have is we have shadows being cast by an overhead structure that the sun is then passing through and then throwing the shadows onto the ground. And part of the way that this works so much better is because it's much less complex. Whereas you had, so where the shadows fall, I mean, it's a textured wall, but it's not that texture. It's a single colour textured wall. And then we've got paving stones, but again, they're not totally different pattern, totally different colour. It's fairly uniform. And it also helps actually with this that it's got very geometric shapes. So Martin's picture here, and I think kind of creates a much stronger sense of shadow and light, and it's a nice balance of shadow and light. It is very definitely about shadows, but it's also about the light between the shadows. What I also like about this is I quite like that sort of slightly more widescreen cinematic crop, which is then emphasized by the fact that you've got the overhead roof, for want of a better, the overhead bars as such, come down, and we end up with this space really from about this shadow here to about this bit of roof becomes kind of like almost like the kind of window within a window, frame within a frame, as such, that we were talking about a month or two ago. So all in all, I think this works. And on top of that, I think what's also worked with this is by going black and white, it's removed any sense of colour. If, for example, this guy here happened to be wearing a bright red jacket, then we would have that same problem that we had with Viji's image, which is all our attention would get drawn to the bright red jacket. By being in black and white, whatever colour this happens to be, it's no longer something that's grabbing all our attention. This person here is now an element in the photo rather than the key subject of the photo. And that's where the difference lies. So yeah, this is why I wanted to do Martin's one next to Viji's. So hopefully then that all kind of makes a little bit more sense of it. If the narrative is going to be about the shadow, then we have to make sure that everything else is supporting, or the light and the shadow in it, rather than drawing our attention away from the light and the shadow. Hoping that all makes sense. Yeah, great photo there, Martin. Many thanks for sending that one along. What have we got? April says, very vivid shadows, looks good in black and white. John says, intriguing photo, Viji. Marilyn says, great shadows and symmetry. Nadia says, the black and white works well on this image. And Nich says, nice photo, Martin. Okay, excellent. Let's move on then next to Anne. And I have to say, I love this one. This really grabs you. And if we're talking about that notion of light or shadow and light, this really is about shadows. We've got all the shadows being cast, but we've also got light coming through, and it's almost like the light is cast into the shadows as well. And I think it's a really strong photo. So Anne says, here's my submission for the light and shadow. It was taken at the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris. So by the look of it, it's one of these where you sort of turn and you look up and you take a shot. And it's great. And I think it's a really strong image, this one, Anne. There's just one or two things that I would suggest if you were going to sort of put this into competitions or anything like that. One of the things I noticed is there's a little bit of a black bar just down on the bottom here, which detracts slightly. And I also think that maybe if you were to nudge I'll tell you what, let me just open this with Photoshop for a moment and to show you what I mean. So we've got the picture here, and we can see here this little black bar. So I would just literally crop that bit out, something like that. And suddenly that makes it slightly better. And then the other thing I would be very tempted to do, I'll duplicate that layer, filter, camera raw. I would just go to the clarity section and just give it a little nudge. And you see, if we just, okay, let's just nudge that out a little bit. So what I'm going to do, take that up to, well, I'll take it up to 45 there, but you can play around with that a little bit. And now, if we look into this, you see the difference between that and that. And it just makes it ping that little bit more. I think we can notice that where we come into something like this part, it creates just that little bit more kind of thicker texture. That wasn't what I meant to do. Undo. Where are we? Losing myself here. Also, even up in the skylight there, it kind of just pulls that together a little bit more. So I think, Anne, it's a fantastic shot. I really love that kind of all these lines and the shadows within the light and the light within the shadows, and it just becomes absolutely intriguing. Just chip off that little bit of line at the bottom, which was slightly distracting, and maybe just nudge that clarity tool just a fraction, and I think it really just highlights everything. So yeah, lovely shot, that one, Anne, and really well spotted. Love that one, thank you. What have we got? April says, great shot, Anne. Nick says, very nice photo, Anne. Nadia says, lovely, Anne. The light on the floor at a quick glance looks a little bit like a butterfly. Don't think that was the floor. Or is that the floor? No, it wasn't. I think it's the wall. Yes, suddenly I'm wondering which way up we were looking at it. Quick flick back here. Yes, I think Anne's looking straight up, so that light will be on the wall rather than the floor. Anne says, thanks, Kim. The clarity gives detail to the lighter parts. Marilyn says, nice shapes, lines and shadows. Excellent. Right, next up then, we're going to go to April. And April sent in this one. Says, my shadow and light entry was taken in New York City in late afternoon. I like how the tree shadow is cast on the building. You can see the trees over here. You can also see the shadow of a building on another building on the left. So over here we've got the shadow of the building falling over onto this building. So that's where April's coming for this. She says people can also be seen in the light and the dark. And yeah, and if we look down here, we've got people kind of just bits of light capturing them. So there's lots of bits of shadow in here. I have to say though, April, that actually the very thing that struck me with this as being where I think you could have real fun with it, and where the real shadow part of this lies, I think you didn't mention at all, which is in the fire escapes. It's here. I love these steps and the shadows as they fall onto the building or the windows behind. And I can't help but feeling that actually it's a much stronger, because if you're talking about light and shadow, yes, there is shadow. There's shadow of the tree and there's shadow of the building. But I don't know that they necessarily grab your attention to the same degree. Whereas if you were to kind of cut in with this, in fact, I'll tell you what, again, let's just do a quick open with Photoshop here. And let me show you what I mean. If I take this and if we were to crop, and in fact, actually just a kind of a fill the frame kind of way, something like this. Now, what we might also have to do is just tilt it a fraction. I'm not sure actually. Let's tell you what. Let's zoom in here, and yeah, it was sort of slight. If I duplicate that layer, transform, and then I will just grab the top here and I'm just kind of correcting the fact that when you're looking up, we end up with that perspective line thing here. So I just want to, I'm just going to stretch out the top, and then it makes the whole thing look more like you're looking straight onto it rather than, and then we just, something like that. And then I would just crop that bottom so that's not right. So more or less like that. And now you see we've got something whereby it's these shadows from the railings and the steps, I think, become much, much more interesting. If I go over to the channels layer here, and we can go red, green and blue, when we're on the red because it's red brick, the red appears much lighter in the red channel. In the green and the blue, the red appears darker. But when you've got the red channel, because the brick's lighter, the shadow then feels much stronger. So what I would do is something like copy that, and then we come back to here, go back to the layers, paste it on top. Now we've got something like that. I think we could come to something like the brightness contrast and just boost that contrast a little bit, something like that. Take the, not sure about the brightness. And now in black and white, we're removing the distraction of too much of the texture of the red. We've removed the distraction of the cities and the building. And I think we're kind of onto something quite interesting here. And again, maybe what we might do, if I really wanted to tidy this one up for like a, no, I didn't want to do that. No, filter, camera or filter, that's what I wanted to do. Then again, I might do something like, let's see, not that. Yeah, I think clarity again. Maybe a little bit on the clarity. Optic vignette, touch of a vignette, something like that. And it just kind of pulls it together just a fraction more. But actually, so there, April, I think it's one of those things where if you're doing shadow, because you had the shadow of the tree and then you had the sort of shadow of the building and people, yes, they were, strictly speaking, it was about the shadow, but it wasn't necessarily shadow which was grabbing us. Whereas something like this, I think where, again, you've got these very wonderful geometrical lines, the diagonals of the fire escape and the way the shadows fall on them. I think that this has the potential for making a much more interesting kind of photo. So it's always worth when you're looking at a scene to go, well, okay, where, especially if you're thinking shadows, where are the shadows falling? Where are the interesting shadows? Where do I need to zoom in and find where's the story? Again, I suppose it's back to that problem again. So I hope you found that one useful there. April, sorry, let me just close that and minimize that and do that. And where were we? So comments. Oh, April says, thank you, Kim, very true. John says, yes, the stairs are the focal point. Marilyn says, love the crop. Meg says, really like diagonals on the steps of the building. And April says, yes, love it. Excellent. Right, okay. Well, thank you for sending that one. It's that those kind of steps, those fire escape things, are such an American thing. It's one of those things I always think of whenever I see movies of New York. There's always somebody like hanging out one of the fire escapes on the windows. It's not, I mean, there are fire escapes in various buildings around Britain, but they don't tend to look like that. It's just such an American thing. Oh, Nadia says loves the crop too. Okay, next up then we're going to Eva. And Eva sent through this one and says this photo was taken whilst on a weekend break in Peebles last year. Peebles is in the border of in the Borders, which is kind of an area just over the border from England into Scotland. Says the shadow is me heading across the Priorsford suspension bridge. It's a Victorian footbridge similar to the one in Dumfries. Yeah, in Dumfries, near where we live, there's a very similar kind of bridge. I think actually our stepchildren used to call it the Crocodile Bridge when they were small. It was a winter's evening and it got dark quite early. There was not much lighting beyond the bridge, so the shadows and the reflection from the light above the bridge were quite striking. I only had my mobile with me, so this photo was taken by chance. So this is quite a fun kind of a use of shadow. So it's that point, you step onto the bridge, the light coming from behind, casting your shadow, and what Eva's done is move herself into the centre so that we're creating a shape within the shape. So the light of the path of over the bridge itself then becomes a frame for Eva's picture, and then slowly it disappears up into the darkness beyond. What I might suggest with it, there's a lot of black up there, so possibly I would say as a kind of a quick edit, I'm not so sure that you need as much of that. I think you could draw that down. Something like that, I think, probably creates a slightly better crop. The other thing I would say is the entrance at the other end of the bridge is really quite faint. And if you've got, depending on your editing tools that you have, if you were to take the dodge and burn, and if we took mid-tones, and I'm going to just try this and see what happens. Where are we? Now, we could just get that down smaller. Now I might have to boost that up. I'm going to boost that just to sort of see what, yeah, here we go. So I'll duplicate that layer so we can see what the difference is. And I'm just going to very loosely run it over these back bits a little bit and just kind of slightly bring out something like that. And then what happens is we can see that we've gone, okay, let's just zoom that in a bit. We've gone from that to that. And whilst it's not much, I think it's just subtly enough, because all the lines draw us into the picture up here. When it then just sort of disappears into complete blackness, whereas if we've got here, and it's a lovely little shape, that the kind of the entrance tower bits of the suspension bridge. It feels slightly more rewarding that there's something at the end of the leading lines as such. And like I said, we don't need quite as much blackness of the sky as we had. But just tidying that up, I think that takes everything that you're doing and then enhances that a little bit more. So that's a great shot, Eva. And I like that notion of, it's the recognition. You know, there's part of what I love about photography. Yes, sometimes we are setting out to create a very specific thing, but as I've said before, a lot of our photography, especially with our mobile phones, is kind of at the scavenger end of things. You know, we are, as opposed to hunter or farmer being somebody who's planning something long in advance in order for all the elements to be in the right place at the right time. A hunter is going out with a specific idea in mind to look for a particular kind of photo that they want to capture. And the scavenger side of it, which is a huge amount of what everyday photography is you happen to notice something. It's not that you set out to get it particularly, but you're in a place and suddenly you notice something and you take advantage of it in that moment. And I love that as well. So Eva's got this point. She's stepping onto the bridge, she notices a shadow, pulls out her phone, takes the photo. So yeah, really good example of that. And in this case, you know, fits in perfectly with the notion of shadows. So thank you very much for sending that one in, Eva. Now, next picture, completely different feel, comes from Graham. And I have to say, I do absolutely adore this one as well. So this is Graham's one. And Graham says, here's mine for the light and shadow challenge. I like the feel and ambience it conveys. An old timer deep in thought, perhaps wistfully contemplating the future. So he's a traveller in the back of his converted British gas lorry. So Graham's met a traveller, he's got a converted lorry, he's sitting in the back, and Graham's taken this photo of him. And this is that fantastic use of backlight. I always say, you know, backlight is the photographer's secret weapon. And, you know, and it looks like a nice little bit of stained glass there as well. So it could have been quite interesting if that had been in colour as well, whether if that had been casting any particular light. But here we have this sort of semi-silhouetted, with just the light catching the glasses, and of course this fantastic beard. And I think that beard's even bigger than yes, it's bigger than mine at its peak in lockdown. And then we've even got, because of the way the light is falling, we've even got the texture into the woolen hat as well. And that black and white again gives it that timeless quality. I'm sure it would have worked well in colour as well. But it's yeah, lovely photo this one, Graham. Very moody, very atmospheric. So yeah, nice one. Thank you for sending that one in, Graham. So what else have we got? So April says love it. Nadia says love the crop too. Oh right, I think they're referring back to the ones of Eva's picture. April says very solid shadow. I'm very, oh yes, okay. And then Becca says very atmospheric. Nadia says, oh wow, lovely. April says nice backlight shadow shot. Marilyn says nice. Excellent. Okay, so now we're going to move on to something slightly different again. And for this, Nich says great photo, Graham, as well. Now this one we're going to Rosemary. And for anyone who really wants to stretch, who's been around on these podcasts for a while and really wants to stretch their minds back many episodes. In fact, episode 77. So, you know, what's that, 170 episodes ago? Near enough, 165. You might remember Ben and his experimentations with different coloured lights, casting different coloured shadows. So this Rosemary says, ever since Ben showed us his tri-coloured shadow back in episode 77, I've been eager to give it a try. It's taken me over 3 years to act, but the shadow challenge was a good prompt. While the Andy Warhol style of coloured shadows isn't my taste, I knew this would be a learning experience. Worth trying, and it sure didn't disappoint. Hopefully my coloured shadows aren't off the brief. I'm not sure what the light shadow balance was you were hoping for. No, to be honest, I'm more than happy for you to give coloured shadows. And what's interesting here, so to run through to show what's happening here, there's a yellow shadow, and then there's a purple shadow and a cyan shadow. Now, I guess depending on what the purple would normally be something like a sort of slightly magenta. But then where the shadows overlap, where the cyan and the purple or magenta overlap, you end up with a blue shadow. And then where the yellow and the purple overlap, you end up with a red shadow. And then where all three of them overlap, then you end up with the dark actual shadow. So well, okay, I'll carry on. I'll read you with what Rosemary's done here. She says, I wanted to make as budget friendly as possible, making do with what I already have. The only thing I needed to do was buy a third $5 utility light from the hardware store to match the two I already have. Score. The lights didn't give terribly sharp shadows because they have multiple LEDs. To sharpen the shadow lines, the improvised light stand had to be as far back as I could go. So she goes, and in fact, actually what she's done is she sent in a picture of, this is her setup, this is her light setup. So she's got a clothes rack here, she's got one of these LED lights with, here we can see like a red gel over the front. This one's got green over it, and this one's got blue over it. Okay, and to go back to the interesting bit, because this is for anybody who remembers Ben's thing here, it's, so just where are we? Yeah, the blue here is the one that's casting the yellow shadow. Is that right? It's something like that. The blue casts the yellow shadow, the green casts the purple shadow, the red casts the cyan shadow, and then so you end up with this sort of, even I'm getting slightly confused on this. I might have to go back and watch episode 77. Episode 77, go back. There's a whole thing there where it goes into detail. But the point is that the different coloured lights are casting different coloured shadows. Or rather, they're casting a shadow, and then the interference from the other lights that are coming in are interfering with that as well. Yep, physics and playing around with it. It is absolutely fascinating. So she says, yes, my setup was, so to go back to here, a rolling clothes rack, 3 hardware utility store lights, a set of coloured speedlight gels already in my kit, and hardware store clamps. So that's how she's made the setup. And she says, I was playing with this for the better part of a day to get more interesting subjects and wider spaces between the shadows, but I failed miserably and then I came back to the floor lamp, which is where I did my initial testing. It does provide some isolated shadows, so it probably was trying to find the right kind of image to use. I think Ben used flowers or something like that, which I think maybe added an even more complex layer to the colours. But she goes on. Also, the metal, yes, this is interesting. The lamp's metal shade bracket reflects the actual colours of the gel light. So if we look in here, you can see the gel lights, the red, the green and the blue, are actually reflected in here, whereas the shadows are the yellow, the purple and the cyan. And then the overlapping shadows are giving us the red and the blue as well. And yeah, there's not quite a bit where the cyan overlaps the yellow, which is where I think you would have got the green, if I'm right. Not feeling 100% confident on this. Where's Ben when we need him? So she says, the most helpful thing was getting to see which light impacted which shadow. So if I moved the blue, the yellow shadow was affected. If I moved the red, the cyan shadow was affected. If I moved green, the magenta was being affected. Being able to distinguish which light affects which shadow made it helpful to know which light to move and in which direction to align the shadows just so. And this is I love this. I love this, Rosemary. The idea that this is experimentation. This is play. This is really, really learning photography. So you've got this idea. You remember something from a previous podcast and you think you'll give it a go. You get 3 different lights. You get different coloured gels. You clip them to a rack. You shoot something against a white wall, you see the different coloured shadows, you move them around, you get different shadows at different distances, different layers of overlap. And all in all, it makes it really interesting. Here's a bit actually, just suddenly noticed, where the yellow and the cyan overlap, you end up with the green just in that little patch here. And then where the magenta and the yellow overlap, you end up with the red just there as well. And then where the magenta or purple in this case really and the cyan overlap, you end up with the blue as well. So yes, different places where they are overlapping. So what she also did try to do was played around with a different set of lights, where she actually used cyan, magenta and yellow gels, but that produced a different set of coloured shadows. Wasn't quite what she was expecting. So yeah, in this case we've got different, here we can see where we've got the yellow is coming across as slightly more greenish in this. Now sometimes you've also got to be slightly careful. What I would say is what the colour balance, depending on the colour balance of your camera or also in the editing software, that can slightly shift things as well. But essentially cyan, magenta, and it's not quite yellow, it's sort of slightly greeny yellow, and maybe that's why it's casting a slightly different shadow. But you can see here again the same thing with different shadows, and as the shadows overlap you get different colours within that. The whole thing absolutely fascinating. And she also says episode 241 describing what to look for when photographing light and shadow was so informative and worth rewatching. I look forward to seeing everyone's submission. So I have to absolutely applaud you there, Rosemary, for doing this great set of experimentation. Gotta love a good bit of experimentation. Yeah, so that absolutely brilliant. Okay, comments here. April says that's neat. Meg says very creative. Nadia says very nice. Love the mix of colours. Becca says ingenious setup. John says I applaud this shot for the creativity. Marilyn says well done. Robert says this is on my radar now. I will be experimenting with the shadows and coloured and and coloured lights. April says love the colours. And Nick says I think I'll have to try that too. Nice photo. Yeah, so there you go. Get out. So come back and look at this. Also go back to episode 77 where I think we've just maybe a good bit of explanation from Ben on how he did the whole setup as well. Something definitely worth playing with. So just a little reminder here that if you have to be enjoying these podcasts, you would like to support them in some way, you're finding them entertaining or just informative or whatever, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. And don't forget also we've got the Facebook group, the Flickr group, where you can ask questions, submit images, keep a track of the Smug Points. Well, in the Flickr group I have a dedicated thread specifically for the Smug Points, so you can see where everybody's ranking for that, or at least the top people. And if you want to submit any images, whether it's for feedback sessions or it's for future challenges, then you can put them into either the Facebook group, the Flickr group, or you can email me directly, kim@kimayres.co.uk. Right, okay, let's move on then. So the next one I want to take us to is Nich in Bath. And Nich has given us a much more kind of a classic shadow shot here. It says this is my submission for the shadows contest. It's a chap riding his bike through the pedestrians on the pavement on a visit to the Bath Centre. Managed to capture this photo as he rode past. And yeah, we've got all the lovely shapes of the spokes and the bits and pieces. All I would say with this one, Nich, is this feels to me much more like a shadow. Yeah, and it's even in you said for my submission for the shadows contest. Whereas what I was really looking for was a shadows and light contest. Now you're not the only one. I think Eva slightly fell for that one as well. But it's whilst yes, of course, the light is causing the shadow. I would say that this is primarily a shadow image. It's a fun shot. It's a nice one. And if it was just purely a shadows contest, you know, generally speaking, if you were doing something online here with one of those kind of contests, then it would score well on a shadows challenge. But I think for shadows and light, maybe not quite there, just sort of slightly, you needed to make slightly more of the light. I mean, there's bits of light here where you've got like the light hitting into off the spokes of the wheel, but it's not quite, because really what it's about, you've got enough of the bike in there to show what the shadow is being cast from, but it's not quite the same thing as, say, Anne's one, where she's got shafts of light moving into the shadow, as an example. But fun photo nonetheless. So yeah, thanks very much for sending that one in, Nick. April says, nice shot. Nick says, I'll take that on board. Okay, excellent. Right, next up then, Robert in Texas. Oh, but he wasn't in Texas when he took this one. Robert says, this is a photo I took in Egypt in February. I was wondering when you were going to start sending in the Egypt photos. So what we have here, Robert says, I like the shadow and natural spotlight on the subject. So he sent me the original raw file as well. I'll not show that one just now, but essentially it's late afternoon, low sun coming through, and everything, and casting the shadow onto here. Now, what I would say is with this is that now the other picture is larger. He's cropped in to try and make the most of the shadow of it, and while the shadow is on the garage door behind here, it's quite small compared to the picture. And really, I would say if you're going to talk about the shadow, then this is where you kind of want to be. You want to be in at this level, because back out here, the shadow isn't, there's a bit of a shadow, but it's not as obvious. Our attention is much more drawn to the guy. Whereas when we come in closer, we've got to lift the sense of that shadow in order so that it's matching up. So our eye does get drawn to what's going on with the shadow. And then at this point, you know, the arm coming through and that little gap of light coming through to create the gap down here. So we get it's a nice shaped shadow. It's a nice shaped shadow. Not now, the problem is, we also notice when we zoom in this far, is that it's not quite as in focus as we want. However, I can see exactly where you're coming from for this. I mean, Robert also does say, I'm not sure the edit is that great, and I hope you will give critique this photo in your next feedback session. So yeah, I'll do that. Now, there won't be a feedback session next week. Next week I will be setting the new challenge. So stick around, we'll talk about that. But in 2 weeks' time, there will be a feedback session. So if you want to get your photos in for any kind of feedback, do that between now and 2 weeks' time. So I will do the critique then. But yeah, thanks for sending that one in. It's good to see you start kind of getting into your Egypt photos. Looking forward to seeing some more of those. What have we got? April says, I did not realise the fire stairs would be just considered a shadow contest. Thanks for clarifying. I have some shots of stairs alone, like you created for me. Okay, well that's interesting as well. I think, yeah, if you're really playing for that as well, I mean potentially, because the way the shadows are falling across the windows, April, there's potential, depending on where you're at and where the light is reflecting, to get some interesting kind of light bits on the windows where the shadows are falling across as well. But that's something to sort of sit and play around with. Becca says, interesting shot. Nadia says, another great image. Robert says, oh, I'm looking forward to your critique of this photo. Okay, cool. Right. Okay, so next up then, we're going to go to Janet. So, right, yes. This was a fun one, yeah. Some of you may remember a little while ago, Janet was talking about Muskoka chairs. And I was saying, I wasn't sure what a Muskoka chair was, and then she sent in an image to... And so, but this apparently is a Muskoka chair. So Janet says, I've attached my entry for the Shadow and Light Challenge. Being on vacation, I had a few ideas that haven't worked, primarily because I haven't had the sun to create the shadows until the last few days in Peggy's Cove. When I saw the shadow from the Muskoka chairs, I had to try and shoot them after discussing them a few weeks ago. So yeah, a little bit of fun here. We've got the lovely shadow bits here. Again, probably more shadow than light, but then there's but it is also a mix. The chair is also kind of, it's not only the shadow, it is the light on the chair with the shadow. Interestingly, with this one, I can't help but feel there's two things. First of all, I thought maybe this would work better in black and white. The other is I started looking at this and wonder if it would work slightly better flipped. This notion, let me show you what I mean. If I open this with Photoshop for a moment, Janet, just close that one of Ayres, and what we've got here is we've got what I want to. We've talked before about this notion of, certainly here in the West, and still I'm desperate to find somebody who comes from a different culture where we read from left to right across the screen, and there are other cultures which read from right to left, or even top to bottom. I think some of the Chinese do that. And I can't help but wonder whether that would affect how you read a photo, because I automatically essentially read a photo from left to right. Is this always the case? Hopefully at some point somebody will be able to, who was brought up in an entirely different culture where that it's ingrained in them to read from right to left. I'd be love to know whether that affects how they see a photo. But what it feels to me though, if you are reading this photo from left to right, I find what happens is we've got the shadow, which is actually your kind of key part of this photo, but then we get drawn up to the light on the right, and then we sort of the line of the arm of the chair shoots us out of the picture. So actually we kind of our eye gets drawn, if I can just grab that tool, our eye kind of gets drawn over here, and then we shoot out of the picture in this direction. Whereas I think it would be interesting if we flip it. So if I go to image, edit, where are we? Image rotation, flip horizontal. I can't help but feel that works slightly better, given the fact that it's actually the shadow we're interested in. Now what it feels like is this line here is drawing us into the photo rather than shooting us out of the photo. And this is because I'm reading left to right. As such, what happens is that line, and then this line of the chair as well, draws us down. And it draws us down towards the shadow. So in this way, as opposed to that way, I feel the shadow suddenly becomes much stronger. Okay, so it's an interesting concept, this, to play around with. Then there's the notion of the colours. And because primarily there's not a lot of colour we're worrying about, and even the white has a slightly green tinge to it, I'd be very tempted to go black and white. So if I just go to, let's say, to a gradient map, a couple of options on the gradient map, let's go classic, something like that. Again, I tend to feel that it works slightly better. Like if I were to go brightness contrast, maybe take the brightness down a little bit, but then boost the contrast a touch, or maybe bring the contrast, something like that, perhaps. But then maybe that's slightly too bright for the chair, so I just patch that up, darken that down a bit. And now I think we've got quite an interesting, this then becomes, I think, much more about that notion of the light and the shadow and the contrast between the bright and the dark, and that notion of reading left to right. The lines are drawing us towards the shadows rather than the lines taking us away from the shadows and out the side of the picture. So even keeping all the, it's the same picture, but turning it to black and white and flipping it, I think makes a difference. So something worth playing around with. Whenever you've got a picture, sometimes, almost every, well, not every time, it does depend on the picture, but sometimes when I'm looking at a picture and I'm not sure if it's working, I will flip it. And just that left to right flip sometimes makes it work completely. I have talked once before about this where it worked big time back on one of Blood Bike's shoot. You'd have to go way back. That's like really early. I can't remember, sometime within about the first sort of half dozen or first dozen episodes, but I'm sure I've talked about it since. But yes, this notion of left-right flip, certainly worth having a think about. But yeah, fun kind of shot there, Janet. Comments, April says, I know those chairs. Oh, Graham's joined us and says, hi. Hi, Graham, glad you could make it. I've already talked about your image. So at the end of this, you'll have to go back a few and then you'll scroll back through the podcast where you can see my comments on you. I loved your image, by the way. Thank you. Becca says, oh, that's such an interesting edit. Robert says, I tend to agree with flipping the image. Becca says, the top left to bottom right diagonal really changes the image. Nadia says, I agree with the flip too. April says, love the crop, Kim. And Janet says, I never thought of flipping. Thought it was a quick edit while travelling. I thought to darken the arm of the chair, but wasn't successful with the editing tools on the iPad. It is a tricky one with that particular chair there because the light is so strong and it's basically a white painted chair. There isn't a lot of detail in it. So if you darken it, it just ends up being a dark grey. It doesn't necessarily bring out any more texture. So yeah, it's a slightly tricky one to get an ideal edit for. But just in terms of the shadow, I think that flip works. And okay, Meg's saying hi to Graham as well. Okay, so you've got your chat going on. You can carry on chatting to each other. Okay, next up then, we're going to go to John Smith, who was also on the mobile phone Crannog photography workshop. However, this photo isn't from that workshop. This is one he took a little while back, which is quite fascinating as well. So John says that this was taken early one morning when I sneaked out of our friend's house before breakfast to take some photos in Sanjo-cho, a neighborhood in Takamutsu in Japan. So this was so John had gone over to Japan and he said, staying with some friends, and early one morning went out. So he said this picture was taken in sort of someone's backyard where an umbrella had been left to dry in the shadow of the washing hanging to dry. So what we've got here, because when I looked at this, first of all, I thought what was happening was the shadows were coming from essentially behind us and we're looking forward. And then when after reading what John had said, I suddenly realised it's the other way around. The light is in fact coming from the other side of the umbrella. And this umbrella has been left out to dry. And what we're seeing here is the shadow of the other side of the umbrella casting on it with the handle coming down. And then there's washing on the line above the umbrella, which is then, because the sun is coming that way, is then casting these shadows as well. It looks like there's also a bottle or something hanging down there as well. And then the shadow of the whole umbrella is here, just in front of the... So we can see then that the light is coming from behind the umbrella, and the internal shadow, the shadow of something else hanging down, is then showing through the translucency of the umbrella. We're getting the shadow of the umbrella here, and then we're also getting shadows of bits of the washing falling onto the ground as well. So it's a far more complex shot than initially I realised, because my first thought was the light was coming from the other side. Once I realised this, suddenly I was able to read the image in a completely different way. So yeah, fun shoot there, John. I like the fact that you recognise that. And again, it's probably one of these where converting it to black and white gets rid of what I would imagine was potentially quite a colourful umbrella, and where the eye would have got drawn to the colour rather than to the shapes of the shadows. So, nice one there, John. Okay, Graham and Meg are chatting to each other. Robert says, great catch, John, good eye. And April says that is a creative shot. Excellent. Right, okay, next on then we're going to move to Becca. And Becca has gone for this one. Says, overcast all afternoon, so I had to get creative. Apologies, this is more shadow than light and shadow. But I did have to use a lamplight to create it. It's a small china dove ornament I have, and I thought it would create a strong shadow. I also wanted to include my hand holding it to add a bit more interest. She says, I probably had images from years ago I could have submitted instead, but wanted to attempt a new one, even if it was very scrabbled together at the last moment. Well, that's good. I appreciate that. I think it's a good thing here. Now, I suppose, just a little kind of tangent here, when I set challenges, there's no absolute obligation that you have to create a new image for the challenge. You can go and raid the archives. But I do have to say, I always get a slight little thrill when somebody has actually gone and created an image specifically for the challenge. We don't always have time for that. I'm realistic about that. We might even have the perfect image that we've taken 2 months ago, 10 years ago, which perfectly fits the challenge. And that's fine, and that's okay. But the idea of actually going out and saying, well, actually, I saw the podcast, I saw what you did, I've decided to have a go at doing something myself, I think is always a little bonus to me. I suppose it makes me feel like it makes a difference, me doing these podcasts. Sometimes I feel I come on and I do the podcast and I'm relaying information. I have no idea whether it makes any difference whatsoever to the world. But when somebody actually goes out and tries something specifically because of something I've said, then yeah, it helps justify my own sense of existence. We start getting deeply psychological here, but we'll leave it at that for the moment. Okay, so fun little shoot. We can see the hand, we can see the duff. What I would say with this one, again, a couple of quick edits with this would make quite a bit of difference. If I just open this and very quickly, in fact, I won't even go into camera raw. I think again, if we turned it to black and white, I can really get yellows here. Yep, boost that a little bit in the reds. But then what we also do is we go brightness, contrast, and take the contrast, take the brightness down a little bit, something like that. Maybe even play with, what would I do with the levels? Yeah, take the levels up. So you see, if we look at the levels here, the histogram, there's a great big gap on the left and the right. And if we take that down, that will darken the blacks and that will boost up the lights. And now I think we've got something, with the way it fuzzes into the texture here, I think almost looks quite creepy. But it's fun nonetheless. Because it here from very, very, and in fact, the turn to black and white, brightness and contrast levels. This is the kind of edit you can even do on your phone. Okay, any basic photo editor. You don't have to get complex with Camera Raw or anything like that. But you can do something like that. Then if I did want to kind of play around with it a little bit more, if I duplicate that, if I went to the dodge and burn, I could take the dodge. Yeah, I don't really want that. Maybe move that to highlights. I'll take this down a bit to something like about 6, just so I can kind of, and then I could, that's probably too strong there. Take that down to 3, just very lightly, just touch up something like that. I could even go to the burn tool, and you put it on the shadows and just run it slightly over that, and maybe take that up a little bit and darken down there. So we can create that kind of thing here, and we've then gone. So if let's see, if I just group those together, we've gone from that to that. And I would guess, Becca, that when you took the photo, that's kind of what you saw in your mind's eye. It's what I would see in my mind's eye if that's what I see, and then that's what the camera sees. And I think there's a kind of an interesting little point here, which is photography is limited. It isn't an exact tool. It captures things not in the way that the brain captures. This notion, the camera never lies, as I've said plenty of times in the past, is very misleading and a complete untruth. The camera is incapable of telling the truth, and it's certainly incapable of telling the truth as we tend to perceive the truth of a situation. So we see a picture on a wall, or we see a shadow on a wall, or we create a shadow on a wall, and in our mind's eye, this is what we see. The camera sees this. And I sometimes think that part of the editing process is trying to narrow that gap between what we're able to capture with the camera and what we were kind of thinking, imagining it to actually be. And an awful lot of editing is about that, I think. But yeah, fun. Yes, you're right. It is shadow rather than shadow and light. Although if you boost that, I think you get more contrast. It does feel a little bit more there. Okay, comments then. What have we got? April says this is a creative shot. Janet says, I usually look through the archive first and then try and shoot something new, maybe a different image or a variation of the old image. Well, that's not a bad option either. Yes, I mean, check your archives and then see, because I think also we are growing as photographers all the time. As long as we keep taking photos, our brain eye coordination is developing. And okay, sometimes we get a really lucky photo, a good photo from years ago, which somehow we can't quite match up again, and that's fine, that's there. But very often there's particular photos we've taken, and we are now actually capable of doing a better version, because over the years we've improved. So sometimes it is worth revisiting and seeing if we can get that better version. So it's a nice way of doing it, Janet. April says this could be a movie poster, possibly for some kind of horror film, I think, when it's all like this. Becca says, that's the texture of many layers of badly painted door showing through. Ah, yeah, but we love a bit of badly painted door texture. Absolutely. Becca says, I'll take that interpretation. Thank you, April. And yes, that's what I was doing it for, Kim. I also keep forgetting that I can edit beyond cropping. Editing is a whole area. We start off taking photos, and yes, cropping is the very first thing we learn, and that helps us. The next thing is learning different levels of editing, and you can go as far as you like with that. But yes, if there's particular edits and things you want to know about, don't forget, Becca, that that's part of what this podcast is here for. If you throw me a photo, send it in for a feedback session, and if there's a particular level of editing you're struggling with or you would like to know more about, let me know and we can use these podcasts to help you. Right, okay, next on then we are going to go to John in Ohio. And John sent this one and says, this was shot a few years ago on a walk in downtown Columbus, Ohio, and the pattern caught my eye. Also, what caught my eye was the fact that John actually entered this into the Shadows Challenge about 9 months ago, around about episode 190 something, so probably about a year ago. However, this time what he's done is he's straightened it and brightened it and done a couple of wee edits to it. And the fact is, it does work. It's nice. It's a nice shot. We can see the straight railings here on the right, but because the steps go down, it creates this wonderful zigzag shape. And because he's then cropped it out in that fill the frame way that we've talked about as well, this will work just as easily on a fill the frame as it would on a shadows thing. Without reference at the top and the bottom, everything then becomes about geometric shape and tone. You could also just as easily turn this one to black and white. That would work as well. I will say there's something quite nice about the warmth of the sort of yellowish of the stone on this. But again, if you wanted to do a black and white photo version, that would work just as well, I think. So, yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. Now, what have we got here? Becca says, that's great. Thanks, Kim. April says, nice zigzags. Meg says, I love the zigzags down the steps. Becca's talking about maybe making up a mock poster for a horror film using the image. Yes, you're good. Right, next up then we come to Nadia up in Fife. Was she in Fife? Yes, or was she? Yes, I think so. Well, she took this one. Anyway, this lovely woodland scene, but a woodland scene with an old building in it that's also getting overgrown. So let's see what Nadia says. Nadia says, this is on a coastal path 5 minutes from my house. And I found the place a long time ago. I took a walk there when it was really a really nice day. I wanted to get the building in, but have the light coming through the trees. This is a little bit about the building. This is Brayfoot Battery, located in the Brayfoot Wood, and it was a key part of the middle line of defences established during World War I on the Firth of Forth. So this battery was designed to protect the Rosyth Naval Dockyard and ships at anchor in the Firth from potential seaborne attacks, particularly from large enemy surface vehicles. The Brayfoot Battery comprised two 9.2-inch naval gun emplacements along with various support buildings like workshops and observation posts, magazines and a pier, all constructed of concrete and brick. So yes, this then is part of a whole history of over 100 years ago, naval sea defences against, if you're looking at a map of Scotland, then on the right side, as you're looking at the picture, where it kind of goes in, you've got the Firth of Forth, where you've got Edinburgh on one side, you've got Fife above it. And so gun emplacements, but all sorts of other, workshops, observation buildings, all sorts of things. Now that place wouldn't work so well because all the trees are in the way. But there's a woodland there. So it's one of these kind of fun overgrown shots here where we've got the building now almost lost in the woods, but the path is going through. Beautiful, beautiful light coming through these wonderfully twisted trees. And yes, this is lots of shadow, but also light with the shadow as well. I think the building is slightly lost in the darkness here, and I would be tempted to just lighten it a little bit more, just to make a little bit more out of it. There's lots of lovely texture in the stone and brick. Dare I try this? I wasn't going to actually do any play with this one, but I think, and in fact it's also a slight feeling of just wanting to tilt it a fraction. These uprights here just feel tilted slightly to the left, and given it as a building, yeah, just so tilted to the right, that just makes me feel slightly better. A little bit of OCD when it comes to horizons and verticals, as we know. But I think if, very, very quick here, if I was to, now, I'm bringing the levels up here, obviously too bright for the rest of it, so I'm going to mask all that off, and then just, I'll take that 50% or thereabouts, and then swap that to a white, and just gently paint that back, this bit in a little bit more, something like that. And it's just a case of then bringing out that building a little bit more. But something to have a think about. But otherwise, it's, yeah, I love the way the light is coming through the trees. I love the way it's hitting the ferns. And I love the shadows being cast. Very atmospheric. So a nice one there, Nadia. April says, very pretty shot. Excellent. Okay, on to the last one from Marilyn, and then I'm going to tell you all what's coming up for this month, so don't run off too quickly. So, final image then, which I thought was rather lovely, is this one here, where we go back into the notion of coloured shadows. And Marilyn says, hi Kim, on a recent trip to the UK, we visited, I should have worked out how to pronounce this one first of all, Itamote, Ightham. Somebody else can have a go at pronouncing that one. I'll go for Ightham. Itamote in Kent. Anyway, instead of rain, it says, it was a sunny day and I was taken with the way the light shone through this window, which was a small but colourful coat of arms. Luckily, I was shooting raw and was able to even out the harshness that is normally captured. Looking forward to Sunday's post. Okay, so yes, that's great. Light coming through a window would have created bright and dark, and because Marilyn shot in raw, she's managed to kind of even that out a bit. And it's a nicely balanced image, this. We've got the coat of arms here, sitting on the door, in this wonderful stained glass, and then we're getting this lovely coloured patch of light on the wall as well. And we've then got, because of the way that it's going, we've got the kind of squarish bits on the right, and these diagonal shadows coming down on the left. So yeah, it's a nicely kind of another way of thinking about shadow. Certainly if you can get near coloured glass, stained glass in churches, or in this case in a stately home, or in certain pubs as well, or bars, where you can get little bits and pieces when the light's out, and especially if, rather luckily here, a nice kind of plain white plaster, or possibly lime plaster or whatever on the walls, which just picks out the colours rather beautifully. So, wonderful set of photos there. Very nicely done. And thank you then to absolutely everybody who sent in an image. So everybody who's been leaving a comment gets that 5 smug points. Everybody who sent in an image gets 10 smug points. So congratulations to everybody for that. But now my pick. And as always, it's never an easy thing for me to do. Which one am I going to go for? But I think for me, the standout image for this, the one that's going to get the full 30 bonus points, is this one from Anne. There's no doubt in my mind it embodies everything I wanted out of a light and shadow challenge. Wonderful textures, wonderful, and it is about the shadow, but it is also about the light, and it's that combination that I was really looking for, and certainly, you know, nudge the clarity tool, and I think that just finishes it off perfectly. But without a doubt, this was my clear winner. And second place has to go to Graham for this. Again, it's such a wonderful shot, and of course I'm always drawn to portraits as well, and Graham has such a lovely way of capturing people. So Anne gets the bonus 30 points and Graham gets a bonus 20 points. And then third place, it was a tough one and kind of good, could have gone at any point in any way. But to be honest, I love the simplicity of this one by Meg. So Meg gets a bonus 10 points for this one. There's just something about that notion of when you come to light and shadow, finding a bit of a building, finding the geometry of it, and pulling it together with a bit of texture, I think is it's a nice simplistic way of playing around with light and shadow. Very, very effective. So those are my top three. Having said that, I think I also have to give a bonus 10 points to Rosemary for this one. Quite simply, just the sheer technicality of going ahead and playing around and exploring and experimenting is glorious. So glad you did that, Rosemary, and thank you for telling us all what you were doing and how you did it. So a bonus 10 smug points for Rosemary for this. And then a few more commendeds. I think Martin's one, where are we? The cinematic kind of thing, that's just, it does feel to me like it's got this very cinematic movie-like quality to it. Really strong shadows, playing with black and white. I think that's got to give you a bonus 5 smug points. And then additionally, I really loved John's umbrella shot, also gets a bonus 5 smug points. So that's the smug point. I will get round, I'll update that and put them back into the Smug Points Leaderboard, which I will then post into the Flickr group. Okay, so I'll get that done, sorted out later this afternoon. Right, so congratulations to everybody. Thank you to everybody for taking part. And a wee reminder that if you want to go back and look at, deep dive a little bit more into different ways you can use shadows as well, go and check out episode 241. Right, a few comments here, or basically it's mostly everybody congratulating everybody else for their positions in the Smug Points. Right, so what are we going to do on? So now, yes, let's move on to what's coming up this month. And basically, the big thing for me is Triptych, or a story in 3 photos, okay? Now, there's a whole number of ways we can do this. There's a traditional triptych where you essentially have one frame with 3 photos within it, or you can have 3 separate photos. But whichever way you do it, the idea is that they are related. Now, practically everything we do in photography is about the story in the one photo. Okay, so how can you tell the story? How can you relate the narrative in a single image? What happens when you get to 3 photos? Okay, does that give you more, or can it just complicate the issue? And the idea of a triptych goes right back hundreds or even thousands of years in painting. Certainly there's a lot of religious iconography where you have a central image and then you have images either side. I tend to think of Hieronymus Bosch and his Garden of Earthly Delights, where you've got images of earth, heaven and hell on either side of it as well. So different planes of existence. So you've got history in traditions of painting, but also within photography, this notion of playing around with how you can create a story in 3 pictures. Now, the mobile phone workshop that I'm currently running in the Crannog down in Castle Douglas here, if anybody happens to be local, I mean, I know John Smith is coming along to it. Anybody else wants to come along to it who lives locally, please do. I'm going to be talking about that on the 14th of June at the Crannog. It's a Saturday, the 14th of June, 3 p.m. So come along to that. But for next week, for Sunday the 8th, I'm going to be talking about it here online. Okay, so we're going to be exploring this whole idea of the triptych, and then I will be setting a challenge. And I will be setting the challenge for 2 weeks after that, which will of course be the not the 15th, the 22nd of June. Okay, so all about triptychs and 3-story photos on the 8th, challenge then being set for the 22nd. That means the one in between, which is the 15th, will be a feedback session. At that point, we already have Robert's picture in full feedback. I've a funny feeling Viji maybe sent me one. I'll have to go back and check on my in my emails for that. So that would be 2 slots taken up already. Possibilities then for 2 more slots. So if you would like feedback on your photos, get them to me as soon as possible. Generally speaking, done on a first come, first served basis. Then where are we at? Yes, and then so onto the final one, the 29th of June. I haven't yet decided, so still to be arranged. If somebody's got an idea they desperately want me to look at, then email me or put a thing into either the Facebook or the Flickr group as well. Right, I think that pretty much draws us to an end. So thank you ever so much to everybody for, where are we? Yes, that one. Thank you to everybody for leaving comments, saying hello, being kind to each other, coming up with suggestions, sending in images. This is what makes the podcast, okay? The podcast is our interaction, is you sending me stuff, is me commenting on it, is you asking questions, me trying to answer it, me getting confused about how to pronounce particular words. And so I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care, have fun, and enjoy the beginning of June. Cheerio.